2. Woo!
Welcome to Authenticity Lab, a podcast where we celebrate the journey of reconnecting with our authentic selves. I'm Dr. Kelsey Miles. I'm a musician, a songwriter, and I'm also a chemistry professor. And I'm so excited that you are here. Each week, I will share real stories and break them down into small yet powerful experiments that are designed to help you live boldly, lead with curiosity, and be your most true self. Are you ready? Great. Let's dive in. In today's episode, we are talking about the power of experimentation in your life. And I'll share a story where I did a simple yet very terrifying experiment about 11 years ago, and it changed everything for me. I'll share a framework in which I did this experiment, and it'll be none other than the scientific method. By the end of this episode, I will invite you to do your own life experiment with a similar theme as to my story. And you'll also be using the scientific method to do this, and we'll talk about it at the end of the episode. So let me bring you back about 11 years ago in my life. I was a person I do not recognize right now. I have grown and expanded and changed so much that I have a difficult time accepting that this is really who I was 11 years ago. This is my capacity. I was so unable to speak up for myself. In academic settings or in classes or giving a PowerPoint presentation, I could do. But when it came to something that I personally liked or didn't like or wanted or didn't want, it was really, really difficult for me to bring up any disagreement at all. I ended up in a very controlling relationship. And in this controlling relationship, I ended up severing so many friendships. I had lost so many friendships. I had severed relationships with my family. I was really stuck. I was on this island and I was so alone and I could not speak up. I just kept rolling down this hill, and it got to be so uncomfortable that it ended up affecting more things around me. And I started to realize that it was affecting me academically. I couldn't speak up in ways I wanted to. And so although I knew it was this relationship that was really the issue at hand, that inability for me to speak up for myself showed up in every aspect of my life, which is why I lost those friendships, which is why I, separated some from my family. It was not great. It was not a great time. I don't recognize myself from that time. And it caused me so much grief and so much dissonance within. I knew there was part of me that knew this wasn't right, but I didn't have a way out. I didn't have the tools to get out of the relationship. I didn't have the skills to speak up for myself. I was not bold. I was not bold. I didn't have the tools. And so I decided to go to therapy, and it was my first time that I went to therapy, and it absolutely changed my life. My therapist was amazing. We walked through and talked through everything. I remember my first therapy appointment, and I sat down on his couch, and he introduced himself and I introduced myself. And then I just cried, just full on tears, just full on waterfall. I was sitting on this couch where I knew that this person was there to help me. And I knew that I had so much that I needed help on. And so even deciding that I needed to do that was a really big step for me. So through our conversations, we really uncovered one of the similar themes was that I had a difficult time speaking up for myself. I had a difficult time having, in particular, disagreements with someone and bringing it up, especially bringing it up with someone who was an advisor or someone older than me. That was really difficult for me. And so one of our therapy sessions, my therapist looked at me and he said, Kelsey, you are a chemist. You are getting your doctorate in chemistry. He said, why don't you look at this challenge as an experiment? And in a way, what he was doing was helping me separate myself from and be able to witness myself practicing this tool that we were talking about, which was speaking up for myself. And I thought it was just a great way to look at it. And so what we did was we talked about the experiment. And our the first part of this discussion was really the first step of the scientific method. So the first step of the scientific method is to ask a question. And my question was, what would happen if I spoke up and disagreed with my advisor? I had a disagreement with him on something, and right now I can't remember what exactly it was. It wasn't life or death. It was probably something about a teaching assistant assignment that I had that I didn't like or wanted to switch. And it would have been fine if I didn't bring it up. I could have just stayed quiet, but it was the perfect opportunity for me to run an experiment. The stakes were low. It was low-hanging fruit. It wasn't going to put any part of my life on fire if it didn't go well. And the most important thing was that I was so scared to do it. So it still had the same impact on me of being scared to speak up. I remember thinking about speaking up to him and having a conversation and disagreeing and feeling physically ill, like thinking about talking about just bringing up something I disagreed with. How simple is that? Yet for me at that time in my life, it was not simple. It was absolutely terrifying. So the first step, scientific method, ask a question. What would it feel like if I disagreed with my advisor? And so that's where we started. We had the question laid out. Step 2 of the scientific method is to create a hypothesis. And a hypothesis is just an educated guess on what you think will happen when you run the experiment. And so in this case, I started to list out things like, well, if I speak up and disagree with him, he might think that I'm ungrateful. He might be mad at me. He might I just started to list things that could possibly happen. And this is where our brains go into the worst case scenario thing, right? But when you're a scientist, the hypothesis needs to at least look at all the possible things you could think of. We often section off all the negative things and think that those are most likely going to happen. But if you can think of those negative things, you probably can think of some positive things that could happen too. And so in this hypothesis of this experiment, I thought, well, I could also gain some confidence. I could actually disagree with a decision he had made, and he might agree with me. The hypothesis was laid out. And so then it comes the third step, which is the most difficult one, which is to run the experiment. Now, anything in science always requires you to wear, it's called PPE, it's personal protective equipment. So things like lab goggles or a lab coat. And when I thought about this experiment, in what ways was I going to protect myself from harm? So one of the things that we did in our therapy sessions was we talked through, we kind of did a mock experiment. And we practiced something. I realized every time I bring up a disagreement, I would start crying. I would just start like, has that ever happened to you? Where you just start the tears start to like well up in your face. And you can get through it, but it's just uncomfortable and you just start, I don't know, that's what happened to me. So what we did for my personal protective equipment was I practiced a sentence, something like, if I started to cry when I was bringing up this disagreement, I think the sentence was something like, I'm getting a little emotional right now because this is really important to me. I'm going to go take a couple minutes. Do you mind if we come back to this in a few minutes? I literally practiced saying that. And so right before I ran the actual experiment, I remember myself walking through that statement just in case I needed to go collect myself if I started crying. And so in the experiment, you want to think about ways in which you can protect yourself some, right? And so these are not experiments that are really dangerous, right? These are experiments that we've already kind of thought about the risk. We've thought about ways we can protect ourselves. They're not super dangerous. And so once you get to that point, now you go run it. So that's what I did. I went into my advisor's office and I sat down and I brought up the topic. Again, I wish I could remember the topic, but the funny part is that the topic is so not important. It was what I gained from it. So I started talking about this disagreement and I remember my tears starting to well up. But because I had kind of thought about the risk of this experiment and practiced and thought about it and was really intentional, I was able to get through it. And I told him what I disagreed with, and he responded in, I remember, being a good way. And I started to feel an immediate sense of relief because I had done it. I had done the experiment. I had done the terrifying thing. I had done the thing that scared me so much. And this brings us to the fourth step of the scientific method, which is make an observation. Look at the data. What does it look like? And when I looked at what had happened, I realized I had felt that relief. I had felt a little lighter. I felt more confident. And reflecting on that experiment, I realized that tearing up was nothing to be ashamed of. I actually felt more proud of myself for continuing that conversation, even though I teared up. It was like I didn't need it to be so perfect. And I think before I started the experiment, I thought it had to be perfect. And in a way, by running the experiment and just observing what had happened, I got more out of it that way. This brings us to step 5, which is to analyze your results. So I ran the experiment. I made an observation that I felt lighter. And when I looked at the data, right, when I'm looking at what had happened and I step back, I realized something that I wasn't even searching for. I saw that I felt more trust in myself. That small step that I took actually created some momentum, and it made me stand a little taller and trust that I could do some of these next difficult conversations I knew were coming to get myself out of that relationship. But it gave me something I wasn't seeking. That wasn't my question of how can I learn to trust myself more? Yet some of this data gave me this new sense of trust. And as I analyzed the data more, I realized another thing, that I had actually found myself to be surprised that someone listened to me, that my advisor actually listened to what I was saying. He listened when I brought up the disagreement. And I didn't even know that I had this belief that I wouldn't even be heard. And so it's interesting, as you really analyze the data, you start to understand more of where your hesitations are and why the experiment was even important in the first place. So now this brings us to the last step of the scientific method, which is probably the most difficult one, which is to share your results. So you're going to draw a conclusion and share your results. And my conclusion was that it felt so empowering to bring up a disagreement to my advisor. It made me feel amazing. I didn't feel that great right in the moment. It was scary, but I did it. I took this step forward and I learned that I actually can trust myself more. And when I shared the results with my therapist, it was so fun to bounce ideas back and forth about how to make it better, how to maybe run a different experiment, and what would that look like. In a sense, my sharing my results with my therapist actually brought up more questions. So we're at the end of the scientific method, and there's something I wanted to share with you that I've learned in all the chemistry experiments that I've run in my life, which is a lot. And it's that any good scientific question, really, any good question, doesn't lead to answers as its only result. It actually leads to answers and also more questions. Seriously, a good question that you run the experiment on will give you data that makes you have more questions. And you see, that was the beautiful thing about that small experiment that I ran. It was this little experiment that I could take a step and then build momentum so that I can do my next experiment. Now, during today's episode, as I was telling my story, I wonder if you may have had something from your own life come up. Perhaps you have a conversation that you don't really want to have. I don't blame you. You don't want to bring up a disagreement. You don't really want to say what's on your mind. But part of you knows that it might be a good idea for you to do so. Well, guess what? That is your life experiment for this week. Here's your question. What would it look like if you showed up and you spoke your truth? If you spoke your truth in that moment that you know that you've been holding back for a while. Think of something low stakes for this week. And what I want you to do is you're going to come up with hypotheses. I want you to think about the specific conversation you're going to do this on. Think about this specific experiment you want to run and the hypothesis you have behind it. What will happen if you speak up? What might be the worst case scenario or the best case scenario? In particular, how do you feel? How will you feel from it? If you speak up, what does that look like for you? You're going to run your experiment. You're going to make an observation. Maybe you were terrified like I was, and then you felt relief. Maybe you were terrified and are still terrified. Again, the observation is not something you need to color with any of your perception other than this is what happened. All right. Observations are very much so what happened. When you get to step 5, you're going to analyze the data. Now that's when you can start to bring in your opinions about it. I was terrified. I started terrified and I ended terrified. Sure. Maybe when you analyze that data, you think, I could have changed this on it. For myself and the story I told today, one of the things I would change is I wanted to be able to disagree without tearing up. That was something that I wanted to change. And the last step you're going to do is you're going to share your results. So I want you to share your results with either a friend or you can share them with me. And the way that I want to do this, so I really would love to be part of a community that celebrates this journey of reconnecting with our authentic selves. And honestly, this is why I started the podcast. This is absolutely why I started it. And to be really honest, this scares me. This is me doing a big life experiment to get out of my own way and see what it looks like. So you are literally seeing me do a life experiment right now, or hearing me do a life experiment right now. One of the things I wanted to do was create a community of people who are doing this. And so I invite you to go to kelseymiles.com/thelab. That's THELAB, the lab. And you're going to go there and go ahead and sign up. Become a subscriber. It's free. And what will be posted there is forums for you to share your results in. All right. And I'd love for you to meet other people who are also doing these life experiments. Well, that's it for this episode. Thank you so much for joining me on the first episode of the Authenticity Lab. If you enjoyed today's episode, I encourage you to join the community at kelseymiles.com/thelab, THELAB. And I also would absolutely love it if you could share it. Share this episode with someone that you think could also use some inspiration in helping connect with their authentic selves. This is how we will grow the community of people that we want to be part of, to push us and to help us get there. You see, if we do this for a year, just imagine a 1 year, 1 week, every week, a new experiment. That's 52 times you're going to push yourself and learn about yourself. You might not even recognize yourself next year. How cool. I'll be back next week with a new story, and I'll invite you to do a new life experiment. But until then, my friend, please remember, only you know what is best for you. And that's why we're here. So live boldly, stay curious, and keep being your amazing, authentic self.
Yeah, that house will always call you.